Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the CMI, and each Friday at this time, we bring you management and leadership news and topics that matter. Today, it's my very special pleasure to be interviewing Mike Clasper, CBE. Now, Mike is chair of both COATS and SSP PLC, and also he's the past president of CMI and past chair of my board. So I'm absolutely delighted to see him. Welcome, Mike. Now, Mike, you do chair two global businesses, and they are in very different sectors. The Coats, very famous for its threads, and of course SSP, with very well-known travel hospitality brands like Upper Crust and Ritazza. Now, they have faced very different, but also sometimes very difficult challenges, and you chair them. How have you led them, and how have they coped during COVID?
Well, it's interesting that both companies saw this crisis coming to some extent. I think the benefit of operating in Asia, both companies have a presence in Asia, meant that they sort of were a little bit ahead of the game and both acted very swiftly, which is one of the lessons. In the case of Coats, we benefited from being in Vietnam and in China in the sense of how to deal with the pandemic. So I think most people know that the Vietnam government did a really, really good job in terms of containing the virus. And in our factories in Vietnam, we adopted a sort of track and trace system, proprietary to us, but modeled on what the Vietnam government had done. And because we saw it coming and what was going on in China, we began to order PPE for right across our global workforce. So by late February, track and trace and the PPE was in place across all our factories all across the world, including here in Europe, in America, as well as in Asia. And of course that was, it was a big wow. And we were actually doing it before the WHO had actually declared the pandemic. So we were well ahead of the game, which I'm really proud of the team for doing that. In the case of SSP, we sort of in mid to late February, when I took over as chairman, what a timing. We were starting to see the signs of the issue in our retail sales in Asia. But when it hit Italy, the management team there said, this is going to be a big deal. And they went out with the first capital raise to protect the balance sheet of any company in the FTSE 350. And at the time, people were saying, well, what you're rushing around for? But of course, getting in first and getting it done was a real benefit. So both of them, and that's one of the lessons when you have to act quick.
Yes.
Both of them did act quick at the beginning. Since then, though, it's gone very differently. In April, May, SSP, most of the retail outlets were shut. And in the case of Coats, we had rolling government shutdowns of factory because of COVID. So in April, May, it felt like, they were in a similar position, and we were doing scenario planning. We were looking at financing, going concern, all the sorts of things that many, many other companies were doing. But then it's really diverged across the back end of 20. Coats was steadily recovering, and we managed to introduce new products, win market share, and that sense of sort of optimism and recovery was there before Christmas, and it's continued. In SSP, well, we all know the story of the travel industry. It's been on, off, on, off, on, off. So SSP, in contrast, has been in hibernation, and we've been spending most of our time preparing on how we'll recover. And recovery there is quite a mammoth task, because as passengers come back, you have to open store after store, and in airports and stuff, that's not an easy task. So the challenge there is when passengers come back, being there quick with them. So at the moment, our sales are probably, running at a level of 10 to 20% of pre-COVID. We've probably got about 30% of our outlets open. But if things go the way it should hopefully go, by the end of this calendar year, we'll hopefully have them all back open. But they'll all be opening in this airport will open and that place will open. So it's quite a logistics challenge. So It's been, very tough, but fascinating, actually.
Well, obviously, you've certainly been tested as chair, coming especially at the time you did an SSP and facing that massive hit. And indeed, the issues that you faced at Coates. So what have you learned as a leader during this crisis? And maybe you can share with us some of your learnings from those two challenging and yet very different situations.
Yeah, the first thing to say is that we've all been facing levels of uncertainty that none of us have experienced, right? I think you can talk about things like the financial crisis, or in the case I was involved in aviation at the time of 9/11, big things, but I don't think anybody has faced this level of uncertainty. And one of the first things I did with the two companies was to say, we're not going to use the word forecast for a while, because we can't forecast. We can think of scenarios. So basically, I've been observing the way the leadership teams have responded, and particularly the board members have responded to, this level of uncertainty. And, I am involved with a very small consultancy called Bioss, which is sort of over the years looked at this issue of complexity and uncertainty. And basically, some people have high capability to be comfortable in a world of uncertainty. And others, even though they may be highly intelligent, you just feel very uncomfortable if they can't have a number, have an answer, have a view of the future that's certain. And I sort of thought through the crisis, it would be great to all have the first group. So we'd all be very sort of happy and not too stressed by the level of uncertainty and complexity. But actually, and this was a learning to me, not immediately, but as the crisis has gone on, that actually what I would call cognitive diversity is another form of important diversity. So the fact that some of our team members, even at the board level, were very uncomfortable and sort of saying, well, Mike, you say we can't have a forecast, but almost go on, give us a little bit of a one, management, please. What that really was really helpful with is the vast majority of people in the organization, and the vast majority of people that were dealing with shareholders, analysts, whatever, they're also uncomfortable. It's not a natural state to be comfortable with.
No, most people do not like change, and they're very uncomfortable with it. So
yeah, and they really don't. So I think the big benefit was that we were not blindsided, that we were all feeling, well, okay, we can just about handle it. We weren't blindsided by the fact that that's not what the whole organization was feeling. And you get a couple of big benefits from that. One, you communicate better and with greater empathy to the organization. And then the second thing is some people are having to make decisions with a level of uncertainty that they're not comfortable with. So enable them, allow them to push that issue up rather than hold on to it and get very stressed. Right. So it was a surprise to me, but that cognitive diversity, I think, was important at how the teams managed the crisis.
And it sounds like you changed your view of, the kinds of people you wanted around your own board table as a result.
Yeah, no, definitely. It made me really, it's several times, we all know about, the benefits of gender diversity and and different ethnic backgrounds and so on. But some of these more subtle forms of diversity, I think, are really valuable as well. And I've seen it in various areas. And this was a new one. This one I didn't expect, though. Sorry, are you hearing me, Anne? I'm not sure whether I've just not cut out now. Am I in the show or not?
Yes, you're in the show, Mike, and I think we've lost Anne at the moment. So it's Matt Roberts here. We'll just continue the conversation for now whilst we wait for Anne to rejoin us.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether I'd frozen or Anne had frozen. Let me keep going. The second big learning was when you're in the non-executive chair, you end up in this position of if you like, wanting to focus on the strategic direction, even in this crisis, the strategic direction. You meant to keep out of the weeds and all this sort of stuff. And in a way, I think you were a bit isolated and insulated from the pressure and the stress going on in the organizations. And I just, because as a chairman, you get some of these insights. You just suddenly realize how much stress the organization is under, right? And the need to appreciate it. And I think it's been strongest in SSP because there's a team there that have done, my humble opinion, they almost couldn't have done a better job given the circumstances, almost couldn't have done a better job. And yet the metrics are terrible. I mean, anything that in their history would be an appalling number, it's worse than that. Right, so you've got this team that worked extremely hard, done extremely well, and it's still awful. And they've just, it's been very, very tough. And recognizing that and empathizing about it and understanding it as much as you can, I think is really, really important. And certainly, it's feeling a little bit better at the moment. But in the bleak midwinter of January. It was so tough for them, and you could tell. Yeah. So they're the real things: the scale of pressure and stress, and this cognitive diversity. They're my big two lessons.
And I guess that empathetic leadership that you and presumably the rest of the board are displaying towards the team there is going to be hugely important as part of the recovery and making sure that the people understand that they've got that supportive environment through which to recover.
Yeah, and it's funny because the board, it's much more difficult to create that empathy because you don't want to be involved. You want to leave it to the leadership team, but they can at least, the leadership team can feel it, and then the organization feels it. Even today, I was talking to Simon, the chief executive of SSP, and he was saying, the organization feels the sense that the board gets it, right? Even though, they're not having a conversation with you all the time. So yeah, it's very important. Anyway, should move on.
Indeed. And I know Anne is going to be joining us again in a moment. I think the tech challenges she was experiencing are just being ironed out. But while we're waiting for her to rejoin, we heard this week, of course, Mike, about the UK government's recovery plan, the roadmap that Boris Johnson outlined. And just keen to hear your sort of thoughts on that, both from a personal and a business perspective, and how you think that will, do you think that will help the economy, and what are your general thoughts on the way that will affect businesses?
Well, I certainly think it will help the economy. I think it goes back to that uncertainty thing. Strange. I'm going to use a strange phrase. I don't know what even it means, but I think it's sort of caveated certainty that's being created, right? And in a way, I think that's a really good response to the way, people are feeling, right? Everybody wants certainty that isn't there, right? But I think by doing it the way they've done it, which is caveated uncertainty with these sort of 5-week blocks, saying that's what we'd like to do, but we're going to look at the data. I think it's, they've got their act together. Some people would say finally, but they've got their act together. And I think, of course, we've been massively helped by the vaccination program. I am truly amazed at the scale of what's being done in the UK on the vaccination program. I'm old enough personally to have already had the jab, and I just can't sort of overpraise. It was such a brilliant, easy experience. The spirit of the people, the volunteers in the car park. I mean, it was just really something to be proud of, and also to give you confidence. So I think it's a pretty good plan. Now, I'm in the hospitality sector, right? And we'd all like everybody to be in restaurants tomorrow if we could, but it's not realistic. I do think, though, one of the things that has surprised me and disappointed me is, in some cases, the lack of global leadership. I reflect back on 9/11 and where the security regimes were put in place across the world very quickly, and there was real cooperation, and IATA, which is the International Aviation body, really got stuck into it. On the issue of vaccination passports, or how we're going to travel and how the testing is done, we're now a year into the crisis, and we still don't have an answer to that.
It's incredible, isn't it? There's still lots of international and regional squabbling, with I'm not using this vaccine, or I'm going to require this and you're going to require that. And at a time when you're absolutely right, need to see that kind of global cooperation like you did at 9/11. It is remarkably absent. So what do you think needs to happen there?
Well, I mean, what I'd say to IATA, and I wouldn't be the only one, is up your game. But I think their pushback, and this is something that I don't know how we get out of, is that spirit of international cooperation, between the big economies. I mean, it's obvious to everybody, and I think that is having an effect on all these important global bodies, whether it be the World Health Organization, with what happened with Trump, whether it be IATA and getting the support of the airlines, World Trade Organization. You could make a list. And I think in the relatively benign economic environment of, the back end of the last decade, right, we didn't really have to worry too much that they weren't stepping up to the mark. But it really hurts in this environment.
So do you think the political environment of increased nationalism, and some would say protectionism, I mean, look at the UK, the sovereignty argument of Brexit, do you think that that's actually had a detrimental impact on the geopolitical world order and the ability to collaborate?
Oh, absolutely, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I mean, I'm only a little businessman, so I mean, who am I? But I think the impact on things, of a global nature that require global cooperation, most of them have gone backwards because of the geopolitical situation. The only thing that I would say is bucking that trend is, some of the activity around climate change.
Mm-hmm.
That is bucking that trend, but on trade flows and cooperation on vaccines and developing, some form of passport for travel, we're backwards. We've gone backwards.
That's a really interesting observation, and I know, and probably you said it while I was off the line, but I know that one of the challenges you see chairing global companies is the geopolitical risk, and I'm sure that you got the opportunity to mention that. I'm going to ask you one more thing before we turn to questions. So you've talked about some of your learnings as a leader. We are in a marathon crisis, but we're within sight of this finish line. What advice would you give to those who are struggling, and maybe especially to those who will need to rebuild their career after COVID?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is that we've already touched on some of this. The uncertainty is going to be with us for a long time, right? So don't think that wonderful world of, very steady progress and, the world order, if you like, going only in one direction, which was more open trade, more global cooperation. Don't think that's going to return soon. So, I mean, I think the pressures of COVID itself, the geopolitical pressures that we've already touched on, the ESG, we mentioned climate change. I think the ESG agenda, which I've been, well, you know, Anne, I've been passionate about this for a long time. I don't anymore feel like a lone voice. You know, I think it's become mainstream. I think it's for real. I think it's not going to go away. So you've got more people think they've got a vote on what you do as a business. So you've got this really, really big increase in uncertainty. So advice, first of all, don't get yourself trapped into, in a sense, finding a false certainty. You know, I think whether it be career, whether it be for your business, I think you've got to think in scenarios rather than in this is a clear, you know, the path is clear for the next 10 or 15 years. We've been saying that about employment for a long time. CMI has obviously been saying that, and develop your own skills. But I think that's a really important start point. When you think through the scenarios, you know, I'm a big fan then of working out, having several options, right? And thinking, you know, if it goes that way, I'll do that. If it goes this way, I'll do that. And one of the, probably it's been reinforced through the crisis so far, is having the options and then choosing when to take them or cancel them is a real skill. So think through, when are you going to make the call? How are you going to make the call? Because you can't keep all these options running forever, but you have to keep them running for a while. So thinking through, when do you make the call? And then the final thing, this is more aimed at people who are in a managerial or leadership role at the moment. The people working for you almost certainly are feeling a lot of stress and discomfort because of the uncertainty. And, you know, it's no surprise there's a lot of talk about mental health, but just don't assume that if sort of things get better, that there isn't going to be stress around this uncertainty, particularly if people working for you have to make decisions in that space of uncertainty. So communicate a lot and empathize a lot is sort of what I would advise as well.
And that chimes beautifully with our own research, and it shows that communication and empathy are just absolutely two of the top managerial traits that people want from their leaders right now. So it's excellent advice. So I'm going to open it up to questions. Our first question comes from Fu. Great point from Mike earlier about how global companies could learn how to adapt from the experience in Asia as the pandemic moved east. Do you think that if, God forbid, something similar happens again in the future, more could be done to ensure the world gets the benefit of those learnings earlier?
Well, I think certainly this sense of, you know, if you've got the experience and you're learning from it, move it quickly. I think what the world needs to try and do is, and I'm really talking here in a political sense, is don't hang on, don't be secretive about these things that are of global importance. You know, let the information flow. And some of the, I mean, we got a great benefit because we were operational in those areas, right? But as we all know, some of the data just wasn't coming out. The lessons weren't coming out, and it really frustrates me because we also see, you know, some of the stuff around the AstraZeneca vaccine and what they're learning in Israel, and did everybody tell everybody? And, you know, I was in a seminar with Professor Bell, who led the great AstraZeneca program at Oxford. And he was telling me stuff about the data behind the vaccine and how strong it was, at the same time as some people in Europe were saying, don't give it to people. You know, somehow we've got to get much, much better at sharing knowledge that is not, okay, I understand patents and competitive advantage, but where the global community needs to come together, whether it be pandemics or climate change or whatever, we just need to get better at sharing.
Yeah, and perhaps less political about what we're saying, putting public health in front of politics would be the other observation. Um, so another question from Diane. Sometimes the chair of the board can seem remote to staff within organizations. Do you think that COVID-19 has, in a funny way, helped to reduce the gap between the chair and the board and the troops on the ground?
This is a really, really good question. My initial reaction is it's made it much more difficult, right? And widened. But I'll come back to that because the felt reality is different from the way that I feel. I like to do site visits. I'm very comfortable with, middle to senior management groups getting together. I'm in courts. Typically we'd have 100 of the top managers together, and I would always attend wherever it was in the world. And so physically, I felt deprived of all of that. To be honest, the management have been in the forefront of doing Zooms and group things and everything. But it's interesting talking to both management teams, because the board decision making has become very important to people rather than very distant for people. The management have been explaining more what the board does, and their feeling is that the board, the people in the sort of rest of the organization are feeling more sense of the board than they did pre the crisis. So it's a sort of yes no answer. I feel more distant. The organization feels more that the board's there and doing things and helping them, and it's all about some of the bonuses, some of the remuneration, the health and safety. So they know we're doing these things, and more than usual. So it's a weird, sorry, it's a sort of yes no answer.
Well, it's a dichotomy, right? But in the grand scheme of things, it's probably better that they are feeling the greater impact of the board, because obviously that will impact their well-being and their trust in your decisions, which is a great thing. So another question from Julian: should executive selection now really ramp up the importance of emotional intelligence?
Well, I think the whole leadership selection has got to look at multiple aspects of diversity, and the thing that CMI has championed for decades, as we know, Anne, gender diversity and now ethnic diversity are very important. But I also think, diversity in this area, right? Extroverts, introverts, emotional intelligence, cognitive capability. I think also age diversity in leadership teams. I think all of these things, the more difficult and uncertain the times get, the more you want a variety of opinions, right? Basically, if it's 1 + 1, the answer's 2. You don't need a lot of opinions, right? But the more it gets complex and uncertain, the more you need more opinions, and therefore you need to be very conscious of all these things. But to my point earlier about empathy and communication being so important, I think that they're right to say that we should be very, very aware of that sort of, will people, as a leadership group, will they be empathetic with the organization?
Yeah, it's very important. So question here from Jez on one of your concepts: how can we embrace cognitive diversity? So how do you know that it is there?
Oh, well, now I've got to put out the sort of warning about being too marketing and advertising orientated. I could tell you to go to the Bioss website. I think a really important thing is to recognize where you are on it, right? I think most of us can probably, who are in leadership positions, because you've seen different people around, you've seen people different in action, you can probably start to understand, how comfortable you are, right? And obviously, if you're very comfortable with it, see it, as a great opportunity for you. And clearly, I think it's fairly obvious that the higher up an organization you go, the more uncertainty you face. So, be aware of it in yourself. But the other thing is, if you are uncomfortable, look for the people who are comfortable to be around you in order to help your decision making. But technically, the company that I'm involved with, we do believe we can predict it, that capability, and then build teams that have a mixture.
Well, that's a great skill. And there are a lot of diagnostic tools you can learn to find out more about yourself and your colleagues. And that's also another way of doing that. But we have one last question from Allison. Mike, what would be the best piece of advice you would give your younger self if you could travel back in time to, say, when you were just starting out in business? So what would you tell your younger self?
Can I give two things? Can I give two?
Yeah, sure.
My father, who sadly passed away a long time ago, he ran a very small business, and he said to me, "Do unto others as you have done to yourself," right? Which is, a common phrase. But if you think of it as a leader, that thought has inspired me over the years. If you're a leader, would you have, if you were a follower of me, right? Would I have been happy being a follower of me? So I think that's one that advice I got from somebody else, not myself, but I took it to heart. I think in terms of what I'd advise myself, I think it would be listen more, particularly in my, let's say the first half of my career. I think I felt I had to have all the answers. I felt I had to control all the conversations. Not that you ever saw that, Anne, but I mean, I felt that, and I think I would advise myself to listen a bit more, and not to feel that in order to lead, you have to stay in power.
Well, that's a great piece of advice too. And listening, again, according to our Management Transformed research, was one of the most desired attributes for managers and leaders. So Mike, thank you so much. Apologies for my tech dropping. And Matt Roberts, thanks for a seamless step in. If you've enjoyed today, please look for the link in your chat, or click on the screen to sign up and join CMI. Thank you, Mike, for joining us today. Thanks to everybody for listening, and I'll see you next week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.